Okay, so time to share my thoughts on the fastest gaming GPU on the market right now, the RTX 2080 Ti. Benchmarks have been online for about a week now, with it officially being available to purchase since yesterday, and it's safe to say that the response has been incredibly mixed. Now, we looked at the RTX 2080 last week on the channel, and most of you have seen by now that from a price to performance standpoint, you're about $100 to $150 better off by going with the 1080 Ti, which performs pretty much identically for that lower price. With the 2080 Ti though, at least here, by spending more money, you actually get an additional performance margin, whereas with the 2080, you get about an additional 1% depending on which card you buy. So we're going to look at how this card performs at 1440p, 4K, and at an ultra wide resolution of 3440 by 1440, because you guys have been asking for that. And ultimately, we're going to determine how overkill this thing is and when it makes sense to purchase it, if at all. Now, when I say RTX off, I'm referring to the current state of how you can actually use these new cards in gaming today. That is without any ray tracing or other RTX features and effects, at least at the time of this video being published. I'm also aware that while some RTX features like ray tracing and the post-processing that it requires, like denoising, will decrease gaming performance, while other RTX features like deep learning super sampling aim to increase gaming performance. At this point in time, it's very difficult to say whether or not RTX implementation will have a large or minimal performance cost overall when it's finally shipped in games. And of course, we're not going to bother with any more speculation because there's already been plenty of that. So a week after launch, prices have settled around $1,200 US over at newegg.com, although pretty much every card seems to be sold out at this point. We will be using this list later though for our price to performance analysis at the end. Okay, so I won't bore you guys with the specs for too long because you've probably seen these quite a few times by now. The most noteworthy details here are the move to GDDR6 memory for these RTX cards, which is clocked a bit higher than GDDR5X. The 2080 Ti also has a much larger count of CUDA cores and as a result, a higher TDP. Also, the RT cores and Tensor cores in the streaming multiprocessors are also completely idle in the RTX cards during these benchmarks, seeing as they are only utilized during RTX operations. The card that we're using for testing here is Gigabyte's 2080 Ti Gaming OC, and I will have a full review of this card coming out in a couple days, including thermal and overclocking performance. All you need to know at this point is that the card is not hitting any thermal limits, which is very important when testing frame rate, and it is also clocked a hair higher than the Founders Edition 2080 Ti out of the box, 1650 MHz versus 1635, but that probably made a negligible difference in practice. Okay, so without further ado, let's take a look at the results and let's start with Battlefield 1. Here we're running the game at 1440p with all settings maxed out aside from the obnoxious cinematic effects like blur, vignetting, and chromatic aberration. And here we can see the 2080 Ti almost operating at the frame rate limit of this game of 200 FPS with an average of 180. This makes it 24% faster than both the 1080 Ti and the 2080 and 25% faster at 4K, running at an average of 107 FPS with 1% and 0.1% lows running quite well also. For Honor is a title which I've been enjoying a bit myself lately, and overall it's a bit harder to run than Battlefield 1, which we just looked at, but at an average of 154 FPS at 1440p, I don't think anyone is going to be complaining with the 2080 Ti. Bumping up to 4K, things do slow down a bit, but still, even the 1080 Ti can maintain above 60 FPS on average, and do remember this is with all settings maxed out. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is a title which will soon be fleshed out with the RTX effects, including ray tracing. We're seeing the 2080 Ti take another 24% lead over the 2080 here on average, and do note we are testing with DX11 here, but do recommend you use DX12 while actually playing. 4K shows similar results. Here the 2080 Ti is able to average just a hair under 60 FPS at 4K Ultra with all settings pushed to the limit. Project Cars 2 ran exceptionally well on the 2080 Ti, being able to maintain 144 FPS at 1440p with ultra settings, making it 26% faster than the 1080 Ti. 4K doesn't seem to scare this card a single bit though, with an average of 95 FPS at ultra settings, and for a bit of perspective, there's really only a couple of gaming monitors out there today that can actually display 4K at those frequencies. There's a 28% lead in Rise of the Tomb Raider against the RTX 2080 and 1080 Ti in 1440p, and again at 4K we're seeing that even in some of the most demanding titles out there, the 2080 Ti is hovering around 60 FPS on average. Warhammer Vermintide 2 ran well on all cards at 1440p, with even the $350 GTX 1070 able to enjoy an average of above 60 FPS here, but the 2080 Ti was making this game feel like an esports title at an average of around 133 FPS. 4K does choke this down quite a bit for the majority of cards, with the 1070, 1070 Ti and 1080 not able to maintain that golden 60 FPS standard, but the 2080 Ti does that quite comfortably and adds an extra 20 FPS. I tested Witcher 3 in one of the most demanding areas possible, and again, even the 1070 provides a decent experience here. The 1080 gives a little more life at an average of 85 FPS, the 1080 Ti adds an enormous 36% to that, but the 2080 Ti can pretty much run this title at an average of 144 FPS at ultra settings, saturating the majority of 1440p gaming monitors that you can buy today. And same deal at 4K, if you're investing $1,200 in this card, then you'll surely want to run this thing at ultra to tame it down at least a little bit. And obviously Overwatch is pretty easy to run as it is an esports title, but I wanted to throw it in there anyway. And here the 2080 Ti is very close to that FPS cap of 300. It's also very close to 144 FPS at 4K ultra settings, which is pretty insane. I also wanted to see what the 2080 Ti could push at the ultra wide resolution of 3440 by 1440, as that's what I personally use, and with that current resolution being supported up to 120Hz on today's monitors, this card might be tempting for those who want a game with no compromise on quality settings and a lot of cash. There are games out there that will prove to run quite hard, like Shadow of the Tomb Raider, but generally you will see above 110 FPS on average here, with quality settings being completely maxed out. Here we're looking at the 1440p result averages, but I have removed Overwatch from this list as it was skewing things quite a bit. But here we can see that the 2080 Ti is 23.5% faster than the RTX 2080 on average for average FPS results. Surely if you were using this card for 1440p gaming, you'd also want to have a 165Hz display, otherwise this card is potentially a waste. I measured the 2080 Ti to be faster than the 2080 by almost an identical margin at 4K, with a performance margin of 23.6% for average FPS, and I have a similar conclusion here also. With typical 4K displays topping out at 60Hz, you really need to be one of those few who actually own a high refresh rate 4K monitor to fully leverage the power of the 2080 Ti. And let's be honest, even if you did have one of those displays paired with a 1080 Ti, I'm sure you could spend a few minutes optimizing your graphics settings, and that would probably get you halfway there. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to be your financial advisor, and by all means, if you have some expendable cash aside, then go for it. It's an absolute beast performing card. It's just not the best option from a value perspective. In fact, it ends up the worst against the other GPUs that we've tested against today. The 1070 and 1070 Ti are coincidentally tied at 0.216 frames per dollar going off of current Newegg pricing, and beyond that, value starts to decline rapidly the more you spend. Overall, the 2080 Ti is an unreal performer, but if you've gotten to this part of the video, then you probably understand how I feel about it, especially at its current pricing, seeing as that's what makes it such a hard sell. Despite having a 25% performance margin over the 1080 Ti on average, its performance per dollar is significantly less, seeing as it costs almost twice as much at the time of filming. So, is it overkill? Well, I think in the titles that we've tested today with RTX of gaming, the 2080 Ti certainly appears to be overkill, but at the very least, if you are planning on picking up this card, or maybe you already have, I would also recommend or expect you to have one of those really high-end gaming monitors like a 144Hz 4K display or an ultra-wide 120Hz display to actually make use of the performance here. Otherwise, quite frankly, it is going to waste. So guys, drop your thoughts and comments down below. Stay tuned for the gaming OC from Gigabyte. We will be looking at thermals and overclocking in a couple days. Thank you all so much for watching. Subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you all in the next one.